Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have you ever pretended that it's the bottom of the ninth, the bases are loaded, and it's your turn at bat? Or how about taking a medal qualifying run in the Olympics? For most of us, our imagination is as close as we'll come to that level of anxiety of competition. For college and professional athletes, however, these are the moments that separate the famous from the infamous. Pro sports teams have been using sports psychologists since the mid-20th century. The University of Vermont started using a sports psychologist decades ago to help their athletes compete at the highest level of their sport. Joining me today to talk about the mind game of sports is Mollie Gribbin. She's an athletic counselor with the University of Vermont. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're happy to have you. And I said in my intro that there are a couple scenarios that maybe a sports fan has thought about, but I know I definitely haven't had to worry about. So can you walk me through a little bit about how you help athletes kind of practice for the game mentally as much as they do physically?
Sure. So just like you mentioned with physical practice, right? Mental skills and the mental side of sports take mental practice. So we have a set of skills that we work with athletes on, and it's teaching them a lot of different skills that they can use in our work one-on-one to then bring to competition. So the scenarios that you mentioned, right? What comes to mind for me is working with athletes on imagery and visualization. So actually working with them to, in my office, set themselves up to be in those scenarios before and really bring in the nerves, bring in how they're going to feel, all of the competition, all of the feelings around that before it happens, so that when they actually get to those really big moments in sport, their mind has already done it before. They've already practiced. They've already seen themselves be successful in those moments. So that's just one example of how I would work with them on the mental side of that, which is just as important as the physical.
Sure. And Hall of Fame baseball player Yogi Berra once quipped, about 90% of the game is mental and the other half is physical. Would you kind of agree that that's the breakup?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think it depends on the individual, depends on the sport. I think I honestly would say it's 100% mental and 100% physical, just because there's such a mind-body connection, right? And every single athlete has experienced times in which the mental and the physical is clicking at 100%, and then they've experienced times where it's definitely not clicking at 100%. And so, as I mentioned before, if you're able to practice the mental side, and obviously you're practicing the physical side on the field or with your coaches and your teammates, it's just such a better holistic model. And so that's why I would say it's closer to 100%.
Sure. And you've talked about kind of holistic already, but when it comes to maybe a team sport, we're talking about a bunch of different personalities who have to play as one. So how does sports psychology play a role in teams?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I work a lot with teams, and honestly, we start identifying the team's values and their goals. So if we know what the team is working towards collectively, then we can actually create a plan from the mental side to be able to work on those skills, right? So we have to identify, like, what is the goal? What are the team values, and how can we create goals from those values? A big thing I work with teams on is communication, right? Like you said, there's a ton of individuals on a team, there's a ton of different personalities, there's a ton of different strengths and areas of growth of individuals. And so if we can really work on communication and identifying how do you like to be communicated with and how do you best communicate with others and really find a way that works for everybody, that's one of the best things that a sports psych can help with in a team sport environment.
And like historically, sports psychology became kind of popular with individual sports, but how does your work differ with athletes who play non-team sports? So if you're maybe a golfer or a skier?
Yeah, totally. So, with those examples, there's a lot more time potentially in between reps, or I'm thinking like track and field or swimming as well, which, have the team aspect, but they also have that individual aspect, where there's a lot more time, or there could be more downtime, right? So that could be a good thing, right? You have some time to recollect yourself. That also could be challenging because you have to keep your thoughts under control and keep your emotions under control. So again, it's going to come down to individual differences, but a lot of what I work with individual athletes on is identifying, like, what zone do they do best in? What is their individual zone of optimal functioning? Meaning, like, do they perform best when they're really, really nervous, or do they perform best when they're really calm and kind of have a really low level of nerves? And so a lot of my work is trying to identify, like, in what skill that you're performing individually do you need to be, like, amped for, and then in what, if you're doing a putt in golf, do you need to, like, take some deep breaths before and calm yourself down? So there's individual differences even in working with individual athletes.
Sure, it's kind of interesting you point out that sometimes people perform best when they maybe don't feel the best. Is that the case kind of often, where maybe somebody's just better when they're nervous, and as an athlete that's part of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell athletes too, right? It's also how you appraise, like, or how you view the goal, or how you view the nerves. So like, if you are really, really nervous, right, that's showing that could, anxiety in the body oftentimes feels like excitement, right? And it's how we view it. So if they're really nervous or they're really excited, right, that means that they care. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Can we work on some skills to be able to calm some of those nerves if they feel like it's too much, where it's actually hurting their performance? Because that's definitely the case for some athletes. But for a lot of athletes, like, it's good to have adrenaline. It's good to be nervous, and that's okay, and that's just part of the sports. So in some of my work, it's also just normalizing that and doing some psychoeducation.
Sure. And speaking of normalizing, or maybe coming to terms with some of the difficulties of being an athlete, let's talk a little bit about kind of the pain side of athletics. Yeah. Can sports psychology help not necessarily work through an injury, but maybe help like athletes overcome pain they're enduring mentally or physically?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? So again, some of my work with athletes might be identifying, like, okay, what is like good pain, right? What is pain that it is okay to push through and that we can actually work through pushing through? And then let's identify some pain that also, like, you should stop the race, or, maybe we should take a day off from practice too. So normalizing that that's okay too as well, to be able to take some time off. But to answer your question more specifically, my work with a lot of endurance athletes is actually accepting that pain, right? Not being afraid of it. If you're going into a race or you're going into an endurance event where you know that you're going to experience pain, that can be really scary. It's hard to maybe get excited about that. But if we actually embrace that pain and mentally prepare for it, and then when the pain actually comes at that point in the race when they're feeling tired, they can just say, oh, hey, like, I knew this was gonna come, let's do this, and kind of find a way to have it be motivating. So and some other work that I can do with them as well is actually putting themselves, kind of what I spoke to earlier in the program, actually putting themselves in some of those mentally, like visually and imagery in some of those really painful parts of their race or their performance, so that then when it happens, right, their body, we've already prepared for it, or we've already come up with something that they're going to say to themselves that will be motivating in that moment to push through some of the pain.
Sure, like coming to terms with maybe the harder parts of the event.
Yeah, exactly, like acceptance.
Absolutely. And when a team is playing, or maybe even an individual, are you there on the bench? Are you watching? Like, when does your role come in?
Yeah, so sports psych is a lot of times behind the scenes. So if you kind of go into it knowing it's not going to be front and center, which is perfectly okay with me, a lot of the work I do is individually, like in my office. So especially if I'm doing work with individuals on performance or mental health counseling, a lot of it is confidential. So I won't tell coaches, or I won't tell their teammates who I'm seeing, right? That's totally up to them to disclose that they come and see me. But if I'm working with teams, right, that's a little bit more in the public, and obviously the coaches know and everybody on the team knows. And so I will go to practices, right? I will be more involved in the team. I will become more of a normal part. I'm definitely not part of the coaching staff, but I'm just more in that support role. And we'll usually be, I'm usually not on the bench, but I'll be like close to the bench at games.
And how do you usually gauge performance, and like how your work has helped an athlete?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because we can't isolate, and be like, oh, that was the exact reason why they did better. But it's all about relationship building, right? So if I feel like I'm building relationship and trust with an athlete, then they're going to, trust what I'm saying, and they're really going to believe in the work. So I think when athletes start to believe in the work and just show, some improvement in what they're trying to work on, right? If it's confidence or performance anxiety, right? And we start to see that might show up in some of their results, right? They're playing better, they're just feeling better. To me, it's not so much about the, how well they're performing. Obviously, I want that for them, but my gauge is more just like about how they're feeling, right? Are they feeling better mentally and emotionally? If the answer is yes, then I feel like that's a big part of my work that I really appreciate.
And do you think a lot of the skills that you kind of teach, maybe through the frame of athletics, have been helpful for athletes in stuff like even just public speaking?
Yeah, I think so, right? Because when we think about, there's so many transferable skills from sports to life. And so, all of these student athletes that I'm working with are college students, right? They have to go to class, they have to give presentations, they have to do public speaking in class. And so, if they're getting really nervous for that, they have some skills that we've worked on to take some deep breaths and calm their mind and body before they give a speech, for example. And so I think I've heard feedback that the skills that we work on in sports psych can be really helpful in their normal life as well.
And UVM also offers psychology center for people just going to talk to somebody in general, but what do you think sets aside the sports psychology department?
Totally. So, me and the other sports psych are specifically trained in mental health counseling and then sports and performance psychology. So, right, everything that we're doing, whether we're talking about sports or we're just talking and working with the student athlete, we have that framework, right, that they're busy student athletes. So the other thing that I would say too, right, the counseling center is phenomenal and it's great, and some of our athletes do choose to go there instead of see myself or my boss. However, the fact that we're in-house, right, we're right down the hall from the gym. We're right there, we're accessible, they're able to just be walking by, and if our doors open they can stop in and see us, right? It's obviously still a professional relationship, but it's much more of relationship building just through the small moments of even passing people in the hallway or an athlete stopping by and just wanting to tell you about their big game.
And we were talking about this a little before the taping, but this is it's a unique thing for UVM to have, maybe not in general, but it's something that's kind of special for the school. Are other universities kind of competing on the same level using sports psychology? Yeah,
so it's become much more of a utilized service across the NCAA and say probably the last 10 years or so, and then specifically in the last 2 to 3, the NCAA put out their best practices and their recommendations, and focusing on mental health and sports psychology was a really big part of that. So I've seen a lot more schools starting to utilize sports psych and posting positions like mine. UVM was ahead of the curve, right? We said they've been using sports psychs for many years. And so it's really, really, really exciting to work at a university that prioritizes mental health and sports performance of athletes. And I hope that more universities, local and across the US, start to follow suit.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, and that takes care of our program for today. My thanks to the all-star crew behind the scenes here at WCAX who make our visits possible. I'm Jolie Whitney, have a good one.